Hello, and welcome to Talk Relationship to Me, the show that explores some of the most important relationship topics. I'm Dr. Elana Hoffman. As a clinical psychologist, I focus on all things relationships, from dating to sex to long-term relationships to divorce. I cover it all. I use my professional lens as a psychologist as well as my lived experience to cover these topics. Do you need to talk relationships? You're in the right place. On today's episode, I am covering what I call the ADHD tax and how this shows up in relationships. So yes, I have made this term, although I'm sure I'm not the first person to think about this terminology, called the ADHD tax. And I have been thinking and talking a lot about ADHD recently. So I have a lot to say on the subject, but I am first going to give a bit of an overview of how I see it at the moment, talk about this thing that I'm calling the ADHD tax, and how it affects relationships and what you could possibly do about it if you so choose. So, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So, there are three different types. There's inattentive type, there's hyperactive type, and there's combined type. And you can Google this and you can find all the symptoms related to this, and you can read about it yourself. So I'm not going to go into exactly what it is on this episode, although maybe I'll do a different podcast on it. But basically, in the name, of course, it says deficit. But I have been thinking more about it recently, and it is really not actually a deficit. It is a type of attention that is sustained under certain circumstances. So it is, it's actually people with ADHD don't have a hard time paying attention to things that they are really interested in, things that are very novel or interesting or are high stakes things. So, lots of people with ADHD are super creative, are really smart. I mean, most people with ADHD are very smart. So that is why I have an issue calling it a deficit. And so just have trouble organizing, keeping track of boring things, and basically paying attention to things that are just not interesting or novel or have high stakes attached to them. So, I talk a lot with my clients who have ADHD about how, their jobs may or may not be a good fit for them, or their relationships may or may not be a good fit for them, or how to see a lot of the silver linings of how their brain works. Because really, it's just about understanding the differences in people with ADHD and people without ADHD. But today, I want to talk about what I call the ADHD tax, because although people with ADHD are very brilliant in a lot of ways, and like I said, very creative and passionate and interesting and fun and funny, and risk takers, a lot of people with ADHD are, successful in business that their non-ADHD counterparts would not be because they are risk averse. People with ADHD really like a lot of dopamine. Anyway, so despite all of those positive things, and there are lots of them, there are also real life consequences, and that I'm calling the ADHD tax. And what I'm talking about is an actual financial cost to having ADHD. So things like missing bills because it's hard to keep track of mail and deadlines. Things like buying new groceries because you don't remember what you have in the freezer, and so you buy something of what you already have, and then what you have goes bad, and that's a waste of money. Missing parties because you didn't get invitations, like you didn't open your regular mail or your email. Your email is disorganized. People with ADHD probably have a lot of tabs open, a lot of unread emails. And these could be things like bills that you're missing, tickets that you don't pay, even getting tickets, period. So speeding tickets, red light tickets, stop sign tickets. People with ADHD are probably more likely to get these tickets because they're not paying attention. And so maybe they're speeding or they're not fully stopping and they're getting tickets, and then they are not realizing them, and then they're doubling in fines. I mean, this is, of course, not everything applies to everybody, but this is a lot of times what I see. Depending on the situation, you might miss appointments, and then you have to pay, no-show fees or cancellation fees. You have to order things. People don't always order things ahead of time. Things for other people have to pay rush delivery fees. So you have to pay extra in shipping, because you put things off to the last minute, or you don't realize, or you meant to do it and you forgot. car servicing, staying on top of these appointments of like regular car maintenance, then if you miss that and something goes wrong with your car, you pay more money than you would if you had just taken the car in for regular maintenance, right? So these are really things that people with ADHD face on a regular basis. And so these are just kind of some examples. I mean, the car example can be the case with any sort of home maintenance situation. It's very hard for people with ADHD to stay on top of those quote unquote boring tasks of home maintenance and making sure, the HVAC system is regularly inspected, right? So, it's very hard to do that. People with ADHD have a hard time organizing things like that. And so something goes wrong and they have to literally pay more to fix it than their maybe non-ADHD counterparts who have systems set up, or they just have the thing to do and they just do it. I saw recently a friend of mine sent a reel to me about somebody without ADHD checking the mail, and even bringing in the mail is something that is hard for people with ADHD to do. So on this video, this guy, in theory without ADHD, brought in the mail, poured his cup of coffee, went through each piece of mail. Oh, there was a bill that he paid right on time. There was a financial statement that he read fully in that moment. There was an ad for a realtor to sell his house. He decided to recycle it, not get distracted by Zillow, to go house shopping, and just took care. There's a letter from school and he just put that event on his calendar right then and there. That way of operating seems quote unquote normal to people without ADHD. But to people with ADHD, that is almost an unfathomable task to do. And so the consequences of which are, missing some things, in that situation, right? And so there is not a right or wrong. And a lot of times, of course, society values the guy that brings in his mail and does all the tasks right on time. And we are told that that's a better way to do it. And yes, in some ways it might save you money. But what that person has, maybe he lacks other areas like, creativity and spontaneity and humor. And I'm not saying maybe this guy is hilarious, who knows, but you know what I mean? It's, just a difference. ADHD and neurodiversity in general is really just a difference and not a deficit. Although, people with ADHD do need to be aware of these pitfalls, because the other thing about it is, when these things happen, people with ADHD tend to be very hard on themselves, right? They miss a deadline, they have to pay double the tickets, they miss a school deadline, and you forgot to send the snack with your kid's school, or you didn't go to this party because you didn't get the invitation because you didn't check, or whatever it is. People with ADHD tend to be very hard on themselves, and they think that, frankly, they're stupid or dumb or have a deficit, because that is what they're told. It's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that something is wrong with them. And so when these things happen, when they miss these things, they really are down on themselves and really feel bad and incompetent, and this really affects their confidence. And so if you were a kid with ADHD and this applied to you, of course, as a kid you're not going to miss your bills, but anything else that can sort of be translated to childhood, it's hard to focus, it's hard to pay attention in school, you don't do as well in school academically, and then you feel bad about yourself, and it's not necessarily that you can't do the skill, that it's an academic challenge, but it's a focus challenge. And so if it's not really caught early and addressed early, and there are many different ways to address it, and by address, I just mean understand it. That's what I really mean, is it has to be understood how your mind works differently than someone else without ADHD, and systems set up in place to work with you as opposed to against you. But people's confidence starting in childhood can be really challenged because of all this, and then you can feel like things are much harder for you, you don't have confidence, and it can really affect your esteem just as you grow up. And as an adult, people can really be down on themselves when they suffer the quote unquote ADHD tax. So, yes, it is important to understand, if any of this sounds like it fits you, think about whether you might have ADHD or another type of neurodiversity. You can always, of course, talk to someone about it and see, or frankly, Google it yourself and see if it fits. You don't have to have a formal diagnosis to understand how your mind works and how you can put some systems into place to be able to make your life easier. Nowadays, of course, we have auto pay and reminders and all these things, and the pairing of ADHD, people with ADHD in relationships can be difficult because oftentimes they are paired with people without ADHD because they are drawn to each other for many different reasons. The person with ADHD finds the person without ADHD to be, secure and be able to plan, and they find comfort in that. The person without ADHD likes the sort of spontaneity, maybe the passion of the person with ADHD. And so this pairing can be difficult. And I can do more episodes on this specific pairing. Oftentimes it's someone with anxiety paired with someone with ADHD. The person with anxiety does not really recognize that it's anxiety. And again, it's just much more acceptable in society to be quote unquote type A, on top of things. Really, it's a lot of anxiety manifesting that things have to be a certain way. And then they get paired with somebody with ADHD who has a hard time with those things, has a hard time with planning, executive functioning, has a really hard time looking at the calendar, planning ahead, putting dates on the calendar, remembering kids' birthdays, remembering that, your partner said that they had this appointment. And it can make for a very frustrating experience. But really, I see a lot of couples with this pairing, and once someone recognizes that they might have some flavor of neurodiversity or ADHD, and they can really start to understand how their mind works and the strengths that come along with it, this can be really transformative in terms of a relationship. And then the person with, maybe some anxious tendencies can also look at how they might exacerbate it, learn to let some things go a little bit. Not everything has to be done in a certain way, for it to be right. And so people can really come a long way in terms of closeness and connection and understanding each other, but oftentimes it starts with the person who may think differently. Their mind just operates differently, really understanding that, understanding where their strengths are, understanding where their challenges are, putting systems into place, cutting themselves some slack. If you're hearing this and you're like, wow, I'm in a situation where it's really not a good fit, whether that's job wise or partner wise, really think about that, because, ADHD, although now it's categorized as a deficit, I think that it's possible that in many years it won't be, the same way homosexuality was in the DSM-3 as a disorder. And now, of course, we understand it's a difference, right? And so, sexuality is a spectrum. And so maybe neurodiversity is a spectrum. Of course it is. We know that it is already. And so maybe it will be less pathologized in the future, and people will just understand that people's minds work differently. And you have to have these systems in order to, pay less of the ADHD tax, but also, be less hard on yourself if you do, and you just kind of, again, put things on auto pay, just understand that you're somebody who's going to be last minute about things. You don't have to apologize for it. I mean, if you miss something or you put someone out or, then that's a different story, of course, but you can explain, this is just how I operate. And then the people who really love you, who are really close to you and understand, they're going to understand, and they're going to see the positives about you, so that is my thought about the ADHD tax, and just more general thoughts about ADHD and where I think we are going with this diagnosis and the pairing of someone with ADHD and someone without ADHD. If any of this, again, resonates with you, please do think about it. This is a common pairing that I see in counseling. And I will talk more about it, maybe give more specific examples in a different episode. But if this at all resonates with you, if you find yourself really frustrated with your partner and thinking that things need to be done a certain way and feeling frustrated that they're not done a certain way, you can also come to therapy and try to understand yourself and your own anxiety around it. And you can really understand your partner, even if, couples therapy is not on the table for whatever reason, you can still understand that about how their mind might work and learn to see the real positives and the strengths in it. But again, the ADHD tax is real. It's a thing. If you're experiencing it, it's not because you're dumb or stupid. It's just how your mind operates, which is different than somebody who has all their appointments and can follow through on lots of things step by step that are boring and tedious and pay all their quarterly taxes on time. Not like I'm speaking from personal experience or anything, and do all that. So if you have any questions about this or any comments, I would love to hear from you. This has been Talk Relationship to Me. I am Dr. Elana Hoffman. Do you have a question about relationships? Again, I would love to hear from you. You can go to my website, drelanahoffman.com, and click contact, or find me on Instagram at dr.elanahoffman. You can find all the info you need, including more about today's episode with links in the show description. Oh, I also have 2 books to recommend on this topic. One is The ADHD Effect on Marriage, and the other is ADHD is Awesome. And you can read both of those to get more of an understanding of ADHD, and specifically the one about marriage, how it affects relationships. So if you have questions or comments about today's episode, again, I'd love to hear from you. You could inspire another podcast topic. You can reach me again through my website or Instagram, or email Elana at drelanahoffman.com, or talkrelationshiptome@gmail.com. Till next time, I will leave you with, I should probably look at the rest of my to-do list for today. Okay, till next time.